I left my cheating wife with nothing after she got pregnant by another man and called me a simp. It was a regular Tuesday evening when I walked into the house after a long, grueling day at work. My mind was still caught up in the endless web of meetings and deadlines, but I'd promised myself that tonight I would spend some time reconnecting with my wife. We'd been drifting apart lately, and deep down, I knew something wasn't right. As soon as I stepped through the door, I could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted. The warmth that used to greet me when I came home had been replaced by a thick, uncomfortable tension. I called out her name, expecting the usual, but there was no answer. A silence that made my stomach churn. I walked into the kitchen and there it was, her phone. It was buzzing like crazy, lighting up every few seconds. I picked it up, intending to silence it, but curiosity got the better of me. My hand trembled as I unlocked the screen, a part of me knowing that what I was about to find could change everything. There they were, messages. Not just any messages, but intimate ones filled with affection, passion, and the unmistakable signs of betrayal. Every word was a knife to my chest. "I can't wait to see you again," one message read. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else around me. This wasn't just some random guy. It was someone she clearly had feelings for. My wife, the woman I'd built my life with, was cheating on me. And worse, she had been calling me something in those messages. A word that stung worse than any insult I'd ever heard. Simp, she called me, laughing with him at my expense. I dropped the phone like it was a live grenade, my hands shaking, my mind scrambling for a rational explanation. But there was none. I stumbled backward, clutching the kitchen counter for support. Every memory of us, every promise, every laugh, gone, replaced with the horrifying truth that I had been a fool all along. My breathing was ragged, and I felt rage bubbling under my skin, but there was no outlet. I couldn't even confront her because she wasn't here. Just me, standing in the ruins of what I thought was my life. How could she do this to me? How could she make a mockery of everything we had? And just like that, my life as I knew it was over. My world spun. I stood there in the kitchen, frozen in disbelief. I needed answers, and I needed them now. The messages were bad enough, but something inside me kept whispering that there was more to uncover. The nagging feeling that this wasn't just about betrayal, but something deeper, darker. I grabbed her phone again, scrolling further up, forcing myself to read every word. That's when I saw it. Pictures. Photos of them together, not just casually meeting up. No, they were holding each other, intimate, smiling like they had no care in the world. My wife, the woman I had been busting my ass for, was living a secret life right under my nose. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. She was talking about being pregnant. My stomach flipped. We hadn't been intimate in months. There was no way it was mine. My heart started racing as I put two and two together. She wasn't just having an affair. She was pregnant by this guy, her lover. I couldn't breathe. My hands trembled as I tried to make sense of it all. It felt like I was being suffocated by the weight of her lies. The cheating, the pregnancy, calling me a simp to this guy. It was all too much. The betrayal was so deep, I didn't even know where to start. I wanted to smash her phone, break everything in the house, but I knew that wouldn't fix anything. What the hell was I going to do? I couldn't live in this nightmare, pretending like everything was fine. I needed to confront her. I needed to let her know that I wasn't the fool she thought I was. But I wasn't just going to barge in blindly. No, I was going to make sure she paid for every ounce of pain she put me through. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the fire burning inside me. My thoughts were racing, and I knew that if I acted out of anger, I'd regret it. I needed to think clearly, plan my next move carefully. I had leverage now, and I was going to use it to leave her with nothing. I decided to take a step back and gather more evidence. It wasn't enough to just confront her about the messages. I wanted her to feel the full weight of her actions, and for that, I needed undeniable proof. I needed to find out how long this had been going on, who this guy was, and how deep their affair ran. I grabbed my laptop, pulling up every bit of financial information I could find. Credit card statements, phone bills, anything that could give me a timeline of her deception. It wasn't long before I found the patterns: dinners, hotels, unexplained charges. It had been going on for over a year. My blood boiled with every new discovery. She'd been using our money to fund her affair. She'd been playing me for a fool, and I was done being her puppet. As I gathered every piece of evidence, I felt a calm settle over me. This wasn't going to be a messy confrontation. I wasn't going to scream or cry. I was going to hit her where it hurt. Her pride, her lies, her life. She would never see it coming. I had a plan now, and she wasn't going to walk away from this without facing the consequences. Once I had all the evidence, I sat down at the kitchen table and started planning my next move. The images, the messages, the receipts, it was all there. She thought she could play me for a fool, but now I held the cards. My heart was pounding, but not from fear or sadness anymore. No, it was from the thrill of taking back control. I wasn't going to confront her like a desperate man. No, I was going to make her sweat. I'd let her think everything was fine, let her feel safe in her web of lies. Then I would strike when she least expected it. First, I called my lawyer. I wasn't sure how to bring this up, but once I started talking, the words just spilled out. The lawyer listened carefully, asked all the right questions, and assured me that I had every right to divorce her, especially with this mountain of evidence. He explained the steps I needed to take, and that's when I realized I could walk away from this marriage and leave her with nothing. No alimony, no support, no sympathy. Just the cold reality of her own actions. The thought of her losing everything she had taken for granted gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. I wasn't just walking out, I was taking everything with me. Her life as she knew it would be over, just like she had shattered mine. But it wasn't enough to just file for divorce. I wanted to make sure she felt the full weight of her betrayal. I needed something more, something that would hit her hard. That's when the idea hit me like a lightning bolt. I started making calls. First, to her parents, then to her closest friends. They all loved me, trusted me. Why wouldn't they? I'd been the loyal, doting husband for years. I explained how we had been having some issues, and how I wanted to organize a small dinner at the house to get everything out in the open and clear the air. They all agreed to come. She wouldn't see it coming. It was perfect. I would gather everyone she cared about, everyone whose respect she craved, and I would expose her in front of them. I would let her explain how she'd gotten pregnant by another man while laughing behind my back. The date was set. I planned everything down to the smallest detail. There was only one thing left to do. Act like everything was normal. For the next few days, I played the part of the oblivious husband. I smiled at her, kissed her on the cheek, even brought home her favorite takeout. The whole time, the anger burned inside me, but I kept it hidden. The moment was coming. She had no idea what was about to hit her. The day of the dinner arrived, and I woke up early. I could barely sleep the night before, knowing what was about to unfold. But today, I was calm, almost eerily so. Every detail was planned. There was no room for error. I went through my morning routine like it was just another day. I made coffee, read the news, and even asked my wife about her plans for the day. She smiled at me, the same smile that once made me feel like the luckiest man alive. Now it only made my stomach turn. How many times had she smiled at me like that, knowing what she was doing behind my back? She told me she had errands to run and might be back late in the afternoon. Perfect. That gave me time to prepare. I reminded her about the dinner we were having that evening. Her face lit up, clearly unaware of what was really happening. She probably thought it was just a friendly gathering, a chance to show everyone how perfect our marriage was. Once she left, I got to work. I cleaned the house, set up the dining room, and made sure everything was in place. I double-checked my phone to make sure I had the evidence ready to show when the time came. Every message, every photo, every receipt. It was all organized. This wasn't just going to be a confrontation. It was going to be a reckoning. By late afternoon, everything was ready. I changed into a suit, something I hadn't worn in a while, and poured myself a drink. I sat in the living room, sipping slowly, watching the clock. My heart was pounding, but not from nerves. It was from anticipation. I was about to take back control of my life, and I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when it all came crashing down. Around 6 p.m., the doorbell rang. Her parents were the first to arrive, followed by her closest friends. They greeted me warmly, unaware of the storm that was about to hit. We made small talk, chatted about work and life. I played the perfect host, offering drinks, making sure everyone was comfortable. But the whole time, my mind was focused on what was coming. Finally, she walked through the door, carrying that same fake smile she'd been wearing for months. She looked surprised to see everyone already there, but quickly recovered, greeting her parents and friends like everything was fine. She had no idea that the life she thought she had was about to be ripped apart. I waited until everyone had settled down at the dining table, and then I stood up. My voice was calm, almost too calm. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "I wanted to bring everyone together tonight because there's something important I need to share. Something that's been weighing on me for a while now." She looked at me, her smile faltering slightly, but still confident, still clueless. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. "I've learned some things recently," I said, my voice steady. "About my wife, about her affair, and about how she's been lying to me for over a year." The room fell silent. Her face drained of color. She started to stammer, but I cut her off. "You're pregnant, aren't you?" I asked, my voice cold. "But it's not mine, is it?" The shock and horror on her face were priceless. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The room felt like it was holding its breath, everyone frozen in place, waiting for what would come next. I looked at everyone around the table, then back at her. "I have proof. All of it. And I think it's time you told everyone the truth." The silence in the room was suffocating. Everyone's eyes were fixed on her, waiting for her response. My wife? No, the woman I once thought I knew, sat there pale, eyes wide with fear and shock. She wasn't used to being cornered, certainly not by me, the man she had dismissed as a simp. But tonight, the tables had turned. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered, desperately trying to regain control of the situation. "Oh, you don't?" I said, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "Maybe this will help you remember." I opened my phone, flicking through the images I'd saved, and I turned it to face the table. Everyone leaned in, and there it was, pictures of her with him, laughing, touching, kissing. The betrayal was laid bare for everyone to see. Her parents gasped, her friends exchanged horrified glances. I watched as her carefully constructed facade crumbled before their eyes. "That's not," she started, but I didn't let her finish. "And then there are these," I said, scrolling through the messages. "You remember these, don't you? The ones where you call me a simp while you joke about having his baby?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel any sympathy. Not anymore. She had taken every ounce of trust I'd ever given her and thrown it away. She had to face the consequences. Her father, normally a stoic man, stood up abruptly, his face a mix of anger and disappointment. "Is this true?" he demanded, his voice trembling. "You did this?" She looked at him, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but no words came. She knew she was caught. There was no escape, no lie that could save her now. Her friends started whispering amongst themselves. I could see the judgment in their eyes, the betrayal they must have felt too. I had been good to them all, supported her, been the devoted husband they all thought I was. Now, they were realizing the truth. She had been playing everyone. I stayed silent, letting the weight of the moment settle in. I wanted her to feel it, to understand what she had done, not just to me, but to everyone in that room. The shame of her actions was written all over her face, and it gave me a sick sense of satisfaction. Then, she broke. "I'm sorry," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. It got out of control." I shook my head, disgusted by her pathetic apology. "You didn't mean for it to happen? You're pregnant with another man's child, and you've been laughing behind my back for months. How exactly did you think this was going to end?" Her mother, who had been silent the whole time, started to cry. I could see the devastation in her eyes. She had always looked at our marriage as something special, something strong. Now it was shattered, just like me. But I wasn't done. "I've already filed for divorce," I said, my voice steady. "You won't get a cent from me. I've made sure of that. You'll have to figure out how to raise his kid on your own." She let out a sob, covering her face with her hands. The room was so tense you could cut the air with a knife. Everyone sat there in stunned silence, processing the wreckage that had just unfolded before them. But I wasn't staying to watch the aftermath. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and looked at her one last time. "I hope he was worth it," I said coldly, "because now you have nothing." Without another word, I walked out of the house. The air outside was cool, and for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. I had lost everything, but in that moment, I felt lighter, free. The cool night air hit me as I stepped outside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could breathe without the weight of betrayal crushing my chest. My footsteps echoed against the pavement, the sound of the door closing behind me signaling the end of the life I had known. The confrontation was over, and though part of me expected to feel some kind of relief, I only felt numb. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Behind that door was a life that no longer belonged to me. The wife, the home, the dreams. We had built them together, but she had destroyed them all with one reckless choice after another. And now, all I could do was walk away, leaving the wreckage behind. As I made my way to my car, the emotions I'd been holding back started creeping in. The anger, the sadness, the disbelief. It was like a tidal wave that I had been holding at bay during the confrontation, and now it threatened to drown me. My mind raced back over the past year, replaying every moment, every lie. How could I have missed the signs? How had I been so blind? I reached the car, gripping the door handle so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wanted to scream, to hit something, to let out the rage that had been simmering beneath the surface. But instead, I just stood there, frozen in place, breathing heavily as I tried to keep it together. It wasn't fair. I had given her everything, my love, my loyalty, my life. And in return, she had betrayed me in the worst possible way. I had trusted her with my heart, and she had shattered it without a second thought. I got into the car, slamming the door behind me. For a few minutes, I just sat there, staring at the steering wheel, the reality of everything sinking in. I had just left my wife. No, the woman who used to be my wife. My marriage was over. The life I thought I had was gone. The thought of starting over felt terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff with nothing but darkness below. But as the minutes passed, I realized that the fear was nothing compared to the relief of finally being free from the lies. I had been living in a prison without knowing it, trapped in a relationship that had long since turned toxic. Now, the chains were broken. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine roaring to life, and as I pulled out of the driveway, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming my life. I had survived the worst of it, and now it was time to figure out what came next. As I drove away, the phone buzzed on the passenger seat. I didn't need to look at it to know who it was. Her. Probably calling to beg, to plead for forgiveness, to ask for another chance. But I didn't care. I wasn't interested in hearing her excuses or her apologies. I silenced the phone, letting it buzz itself out. I had said everything I needed to say, and there was nothing she could say to change what had happened. She was dead to me now, just a shadow of the person I thought she was. The road stretched out in front of me, dark and empty, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I didn't know where I was going, but that didn't matter. All that mattered was that I was moving forward. I didn't know what my life would look like without her, but I knew one thing for sure. It would be mine again. The drive felt endless, the rhythmic hum of the tires on the asphalt giving me time to think. Too much time, maybe. Memories of her, of us, flashed through my mind. The happy moments, the times when I truly believed we were building something real. It was hard to reconcile those memories with the reality of what she had done. It was like the person I loved never really existed. I finally pulled into a parking lot at a small diner off the highway. I had no plan, no destination. I just needed to stop, to clear my head. The neon sign flickered, open 24 hours, casting a dim glow over the empty parking lot. I stepped out of the car, the cool air biting against my skin as I walked inside. The place was nearly empty, just a few truckers scattered at the counter and a tired-looking waitress wiping down tables. I took a seat in the back corner, away from everyone. I needed space. I needed quiet. The waitress came over, offering me a menu and a sympathetic smile. "Rough night?" she asked, her voice soft but knowing. I must have looked like hell, but I just nodded, not really in the mood to talk. "I'll have some coffee," I said, and she poured a steaming cup in front of me, leaving me to my thoughts. As I stared into the swirling dark liquid, the weight of the night began to sink in. The reality of what I had just done. I wasn't going back home. That house, that life, it wasn't mine anymore. I had walked out, and with that, I had closed the door on everything I thought I wanted. For years, I had been the guy who did everything right. The guy who worked hard, stayed loyal, and built a life around someone else's needs. And for what? To be made a fool of? To be called a simp and discarded like I was nothing? No, I wasn't that guy anymore. I couldn't be. The coffee tasted bitter, but it jolted me awake. I needed to start thinking about what came next. Divorce was inevitable, and I had already taken steps to ensure she wouldn't take anything from me. But what did I want? What did I even have left? I hadn't been single in years. I hadn't even thought about what my life would look like without her. For so long, everything had been tied to that marriage, to our future together. But now, that future was gone, and I was free to create a new one. It was a strange feeling, this freedom. It felt like standing on the edge of an open field, nothing in front of me but possibility. And while part of me still felt the sting of betrayal, another part of me was excited. Excited to see what I could do with this blank slate. The waitress came by again, offering me a refill. I glanced at the clock on the wall, almost midnight. Tomorrow would be the start of something new, but tonight, I just needed a few more minutes to sit in the quiet and let the dust settle. As I sipped my second cup of coffee, I started to feel it, a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me that I wasn't finished yet. Life had thrown me a curveball, but I was still standing. And now, with her out of the picture, I could finally start living for myself again. For years, I had let someone else dictate the terms of my happiness, but now, I was taking control. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was on the right path. I left a tip on the table, thanked the waitress, and walked out into the night. The road was still waiting for me, open and wide, with no end in sight. And for the first time in a long time, I was ready to see where it would take me. The next morning, I woke up in a cheap motel off the highway, my body stiff from the restless night I'd spent tossing and turning. The events from the previous evening replayed in my mind, and for a moment, I wondered if it had all been a bad dream. But reality hit hard when I saw my phone, still buzzing with missed calls and messages from her. I ignored them. She didn't deserve my attention, not anymore. I had bigger things to focus on now, like figuring out what came next. There was no going back to the life I had, but I needed to figure out how to move forward. As I sat on the edge of the motel bed, staring blankly at the flickering TV in the corner of the room, I realized I had no idea where to start. I knew one thing, though. I wasn't going to let her drag me back into her mess. She would try, I was sure of that. She would beg, cry, promise to change, anything to keep the life she'd thrown away. But I wasn't interested in playing her game anymore. I was done. The first step was to meet with my lawyer and finalize everything. I needed to make sure the divorce went through quickly, cleanly, and without any complications. The last thing I wanted was for her to somehow cling to me, to try to hold on to the life she had already destroyed. I was going to sever every tie, burn every bridge, and make sure she had no way of getting anything from me. I grabbed my phone and called my lawyer. After a few minutes of discussing the details, he assured me that the case would move forward swiftly. There was no way she could claim anything once the evidence was presented in court. Her betrayal was clear, and the pregnancy with another man made it even worse for her. I'd be walking away clean, and she'd be left with the mess she created. As I hung up the phone, a strange sense of closure started to settle in. This wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was the life I had now. I had spent so many years building everything around her, but now, for the first time in a long time, I was building for myself. I checked out of the motel and hit the road again. The open highway stretched out before me, and I felt a sense of freedom with every mile I put between myself and the disaster I'd left behind. I didn't know where I was going yet, But that was okay. I had time to figure it out. I drove aimlessly for hours, letting my thoughts drift. For the first time, I allowed myself to reflect on what had really happened. How had I let things get this far? How had I missed all the signs? She had been cheating for over a year, and I had been completely blind to it. But then, as I thought about it more, I realized it wasn't blindness, it was trust. I had trusted her, believed in her, the way a husband should. And she had taken that trust and turned it into a joke. She had made me the fool. But I wasn't the fool anymore. By the time the sun started to set, I found myself on the outskirts of a small town, the kind of place where nobody knew your name and nobody cared about your past. I pulled into a quiet diner, parked my car, and sat there for a moment, watching the golden light fade behind the trees. I hadn't thought about where I would go or what I would do next. I didn't need to figure it all out at once. But for now, this small town, with its quiet streets and peaceful vibe, felt like a good place to start. I got out of the car, walked into the diner, and took a seat by the window. The waitress came over, smiling politely, and handed me a menu. As I looked out the window at the empty street, I realized that maybe starting over wasn't as terrifying as I'd thought. Maybe it was exactly what I needed. The quiet town felt like a safe harbor in the storm that had been my life. I stayed there for a few days, longer than I had planned, but I needed the time. The motel was cheap, the diner staff knew me by name after 2 days, and the small town vibe gave me space to breathe, to think. The mornings were quiet, almost peaceful. I'd get up, grab coffee from the local cafe, and sit by the lake just on the outskirts of town. The gentle rippling water seemed to mirror the way my life was slowly settling down. I needed this time away. It gave me the chance to process everything that had happened without being overwhelmed by the constant reminders of my old life. But as the days passed, something strange happened. I stopped thinking about her. The text had slowed down. The missed calls had become less frequent. She was losing her grip on me, and I was finally starting to feel like myself again. On the 4th morning, I was sipping my coffee when I got a call from my lawyer. The divorce papers had been delivered to her, and she had signed them. Just like that, it was done. The marriage was officially over, and with it, every tie that had once bound me to her. I didn't feel the sadness I had expected. Instead, I felt free. I spent that afternoon driving around the town, thinking about what I wanted to do next. For the first time in a long time, I didn't have anyone else's expectations hanging over me. I didn't have to answer to anyone, didn't have to worry about someone else's plans. It was just me. I had no job lined up, no home waiting for me to go back to, but strangely, that didn't scare me. I had my savings, I had my health, and now I had a fresh start. It was time to rebuild. Not the life I had with her, but something new, something that was mine alone. As I passed a rundown building with a "For Lease" sign in the window, an idea started forming in my mind. I had always wanted to do something different, something meaningful. The corporate world had paid the bills, but it hadn't fed my soul. What if I opened my own business? This town had potential, and something about the quiet streets and tight-knit community made me think it could be the perfect place to start over. The idea stuck with me all evening. I sat at the diner, doodling ideas on napkins, imagining what I could create here. Maybe a cafe, a bookstore, or something creative. I hadn't thought about the logistics yet, but the thought of building something from the ground up, something that was entirely mine, sparked a fire in me. For the first time in months, I felt excited about the future. I had been so caught up in the mess of my marriage, so focused on the betrayal, that I hadn't allowed myself to think about what I actually wanted. Now that the storm had passed, I could see clearly. I could feel the pull of a new beginning. I stayed in that diner for hours, sketching ideas, jotting down thoughts, and by the time the sun had set, I had a rough plan. The excitement buzzing in my chest was a feeling I hadn't had in a long time, and it fueled me. When I finally left the diner that night, I knew that this was the place I was going to build my new life. The past was behind me, and there was nothing left to go back to. All that mattered now was what lay ahead. As I stood outside the diner, looking down the quiet street, I realized that I wasn't just healing, I was growing. And maybe, just maybe, I had been meant to end up here all along. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The idea of starting my own business had latched onto me, refusing to let go. There was something liberating about the thought of creating something from scratch, something that was entirely mine. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, the challenge didn't scare me, it motivated me. I grabbed my coffee and decided to take a walk around town, letting myself get familiar with the place I would now call home. It was small, but it had a charm to it. People waved as they passed by, and the shopkeepers smiled when I peeked through their windows. It was a world away from the fast-paced life I had left behind, and that was exactly what I needed. As I passed by the rundown building I had noticed the day before, I stopped and stared at it. The "For Lease" sign in the window looked faded, like it had been there for months, maybe even years. It wasn't much to look at: peeling paint, cracked windows, a door that looked like it might fall off its hinges. But I saw potential. Where others saw an eyesore, I saw a blank canvas. Without hesitation, I pulled out my phone and called the number on the sign. The landlord was a man named Harold, and within an hour, I was standing inside the building, walking through it with him. "It needs some work, that's for sure," Harold said, scratching his chin as he looked around. "But it's got good bones." I nodded, my mind already racing with ideas. The space wasn't big, but it didn't need to be. It just needed to feel right. "What do you think?" Harold asked, watching me closely. "I think I'll take it," I said, surprising even myself with how sure I felt. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting me to decide so quickly, but he smiled and nodded. "All right then. We can draw up the paperwork. It's yours if you're serious." "I'm serious," I said, feeling a surge of excitement. This was it, the first real step in my new life. After Harold and I worked out the details, I walked out of the building with a lease agreement in hand. I stood outside for a moment, staring at the place that would soon become mine. It still didn't feel real, but I knew that with every step I took, I was moving further away from the mess I had left behind and closer to something better. I spent the rest of the day sketching out plans, making lists of what needed to be done. Paint, repairs, furniture, equipment. I needed everything. It was overwhelming, but in the best way possible. Every item on that list represented a piece of my new future, a future where I was in control. As I sat in the cafe that evening, going over my notes, I realized how far I had come in such a short time. Just a week ago, I had been drowning in betrayal, my life shattered by the discovery of my wife's affair. But now, I was building something new, something that was entirely mine. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, and I knew I would face setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid of what was to come. I had survived the worst of it, and I was stronger for it. The next few weeks flew by in a blur of activity. I threw myself into the renovations, working late into the night to get the place ready. Every day, the space transformed a little more, and with each change, I felt like I was getting closer to reclaiming my life. And then, one afternoon, as I stood in the middle of the freshly painted room, I realized it. This was my second chance, my new beginning, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it away from me. The weeks of hard work transformed the old, run-down building into something I could be proud of. The fresh paint on the walls, the new light fixtures, the carefully chosen furniture. It all came together better than I had imagined. I had poured everything I had into this place, and now it was real. It was no longer just an idea or a dream. It was mine. I decided to open a cafe, a place where people could come, relax, and enjoy a cup of coffee or tea. It was simple, but I wanted it to be more than just a cafe. I wanted it to be a place where the community could gather, where strangers could become friends, and where people felt welcome, no matter who they were. Opening day came faster than I expected. As I stood behind the counter that morning, nervously waiting for the first customers to walk through the door, I realized how much had changed. I was no longer the man whose life had been wrecked by betrayal. I was someone new. I had built this place from the ground up, and it was a reflection of everything I had become: resilient, determined, and ready for whatever came next. The bell above the door jingled, and my heart skipped a beat. My first customer. It was the waitress from the diner, the one who had served me that first night when I was still lost and trying to figure out what to do with my life. "Hey there," she said, smiling as she approached the counter. "I heard you were opening today." Thought I'd stop by and check it out. I smiled back, grateful for her familiar face. Welcome to my cafe, I said, gesturing around. What can I get you? She looked around, nodding approvingly. I'll take a coffee, black. As I poured her cup, more people started trickling in. One by one, they came, locals, curious to see what the new place in town was all about. Some were regulars from the diner, others I didn't recognize, but they all greeted me with the same warmth I had come to expect from this small town. The day flew by, a steady stream of customers keeping me busy, and as I watched people sit down at the tables, chatting with one another or enjoying their coffee in peace, I realized that the cafe was already becoming what I had hoped for, a community hub, a place where people could come together. By the time I closed up that evening, I was exhausted but exhilarated. I had done it. I had opened my own business, and it was a success. But it wasn't just about the cafe. It was about reclaiming my life, taking control of my future, and proving to myself that I was capable of more than I ever thought possible. As I locked the door and turned off the lights, I felt a sense of pride that I hadn't felt in a long time. This was my new beginning, and I had earned every bit of it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The cafe became a popular spot in town, with regulars stopping by every day, bringing new faces with them. I started recognizing the same people coming in at the same time each morning, ordering their favorite drinks, and chatting with me like old friends. One day, Harold, the landlord, came by. I gotta say, he said, looking around, I didn't expect this place to turn around so fast. You've done a hell of a job. Thanks, I said, feeling a swell of pride. It's been a lot of work, but it's worth it. He nodded. You've built something special here, you know that? People around here are talking. They like having a place like this. Hearing that felt like validation of everything I had gone through. I wasn't just rebuilding my life. I was becoming part of something bigger. I had found a community, and I was making a difference in it. As Harold left, I looked around the cafe, feeling a sense of contentment wash over me. The pain and betrayal of the past were still there, buried deep, but they didn't define me anymore. I had taken the broken pieces of my life and built something new, something stronger. Life had started to take on a new rhythm, and I settled into it comfortably. The cafe was doing well, better than I'd hoped for so early on, and the community had welcomed me with open arms. I was finally starting to feel like I had control over my life again, something that had seemed impossible not too long ago. But then, one day, a piece of my past walked right through the door. I was behind the counter, preparing a latte for one of the regulars when the bell above the door jingled. Without thinking, I glanced up to greet the new customer, but the words caught in my throat. Standing there, looking as shocked as I felt, was her. Asterisk my ex-wife. Asterisk. She froze for a moment, as if she hadn't expected to find me here. I certainly hadn't expected to see her. The cafe went silent, or maybe it just felt that way. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if I was going to explode in anger or collapse from the shock. We hadn't spoken since the divorce was finalized. No messages, no calls, nothing. And now here she was, standing in the middle of my cafe, looking completely out of place. Her eyes flicked around the room, taking in the warm, welcoming space that I had created. I wondered what she was thinking, if she was surprised by what I had built, if she had expected me to still be the broken man she'd left behind. Part of me wanted to know, but a bigger part of me didn't care. I finished making the latte and handed it to the customer, forcing myself to act normal. The last thing I wanted was to make a scene. She didn't deserve that kind of power over me anymore. Finally, she stepped forward, approaching the counter. I didn't know you were here, she said quietly, her voice tentative. I met her gaze, my expression as neutral as I could make it. Well, now you know. She fidgeted with her hands, clearly uncomfortable. I just moved to a town nearby. I didn't think I'd run into you. Life's funny that way, I replied, keeping my tone flat. For a moment, there was silence between us. It was strange, seeing her now. She looked the same, but at the same time, different. It was like I was looking at a stranger, someone I used to know but had no connection to anymore. The hurt, the betrayal, it was all still there, somewhere in the background, but it felt distant. She cleared her throat. I heard about the cafe, she said, her eyes scanning the space again. It's nice. You've done a good job. I didn't respond right away, still processing the surrealness of the situation. I hadn't expected her to ever acknowledge what I had built, let alone show up here. Part of me wanted to throw her out, to tell her she had no right to be in my new life. But I had moved on. I had built something better. She didn't have that hold on me anymore. Thanks, I finally said, keeping it short. She shifted on her feet, clearly unsure of what to say next. I just wanted to apologize, she blurted out. For everything. I could feel the air around me tighten, the weight of those words hanging between us. There was a time when I would have given anything to hear her say that. But now, standing here in my cafe, with my new life firmly in place, the apology didn't mean what it would have meant back then. Apology accepted, I said, my voice calm and steady. But it doesn't change anything. She looked down at the floor, her face full of regret. I know, she whispered. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But then I reminded myself of everything I'd been through, everything I'd overcome to get to this point. I had no room in my life for her guilt or her attempts at reconciliation. I didn't need closure from her. I had already found it in myself. I've moved on, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. And you should too. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. I'm sorry, she said again, but this time, I could tell she meant it. Without another word, she turned and left the cafe. The bell jingled as the door closed behind her, and just like that, she was gone. I stood there for a moment, letting the tension drain from my body. The storm had passed, and I was still standing. I took a deep breath and went back to work, knowing that this time, I had truly closed the door on that chapter of my life. As the door closed behind her, I stood still for a few moments, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. She was gone. Not just from the cafe, but from my life. Truly, finally gone. That brief interaction had done something I didn't expect. It felt like a weight I didn't even realize I was carrying had been lifted. Her apology didn't undo the damage, but I didn't need it to. I had already moved past her, past everything she had put me through. For months, I had been holding on to some lingering anger, a small part of me still bitter about what she had done. But now, standing here, I felt lighter. I had survived the worst of it. Her betrayal had destroyed the man I used to be, but in doing so, it had cleared the way for the man I was becoming. I went back to work, serving customers, cleaning tables, and making drinks like it was just another day. But inside, I felt a sense of finality. It was over. I didn't have to think about her anymore, didn't have to wonder about the what-ifs or the whys. None of it mattered now. That night, as I closed up the cafe, I found myself thinking about everything I had accomplished since leaving her behind. The cafe wasn't just a business. It was a symbol of everything I had built on my own, without her. It represented my new life, my independence, and my resilience. After locking the door, I stood outside the cafe, looking up at the sign I had hung just a few weeks ago. The sign that bore the name I had chosen, a name that now meant everything to me. It was more than just a cafe. It was my sanctuary, my proof that I had survived, that I had thrived despite everything. As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. The anger, the bitterness, the sadness, it was all behind me now. I wasn't that broken man anymore. I had rebuilt my life from the ground up, and I had done it on my own terms. The next morning, I woke up early, feeling more energized than I had in months. I drove to the cafe, ready for the day ahead, but this time with a clearer mind. The past was behind me, and I was focused on the future. As the day went on, regulars came and went, each one greeting me with a smile and a friendly word. It was a typical day, but it felt different. Lighter, somehow. Like a new chapter had officially begun. Around midday, Harold, the landlord, stopped by again. He had become a regular himself, and we had struck up a friendship over the past few weeks. Business still booming? He asked, taking a seat at the counter. Yeah, things are going great, I said, smiling as I handed him his usual coffee. You seem different today, he observed, eyeing me curiously. I shrugged, leaning on the counter. Had a bit of a run-in with my ex yesterday. Harold raised an eyebrow. That must have been something. It was, I admitted. But it's over now. She's out of my life for good. Harold nodded slowly, taking a sip of his coffee. Good for you. It's about time, don't you think? Yeah, I said, feeling the truth of his words. It is. As Harold left the cafe later, I realized how right he was. It was about time. I had spent so long letting the past control me, letting her actions dictate how I felt. But now, I was free. Truly free. The rest of the day passed without incident, but as I closed up that evening, I found myself thinking about the future. There was so much more I wanted to do. More plans for the cafe, more adventures to be had. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't scare me. It excited me. The days turned into weeks, and life settled into a comfortable rhythm. The cafe had become a fixture in the town, a place where people gathered not just for coffee but for conversation and connection. Every day brought new faces, and with each new customer, I felt more grounded in this life I was building. The past was fading into the background, and the future felt wide open. I spent more time focusing on the cafe's growth, trying new things, hosting small events, and creating a space where people could feel like they belonged. It wasn't just about running a business anymore. It was about creating something meaningful, something that would last. One afternoon, while I was behind the counter experimenting with new drink recipes, a young woman walked in. She had been in a few times before, usually keeping to herself with a book in hand. But today she approached the counter with a shy smile. "I don't know if you remember me," she said, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, "but I've been coming here for a while. I just wanted to say how much I love this place." Her words caught me off guard, but in a good way. I smiled. "Thank you. I'm glad you like it. What's your name?" "Jessica," she replied, her smile growing a little wider. "I come here to write sometimes. The atmosphere, it's perfect for it." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "A writer, huh? What kind of stuff do you write?" She blushed a little. "Mostly short stories. Some personal essays, too." I nodded, impressed. "That's great. I'm always happy to support creative people." There was a brief pause, the kind that happens when you realize you've found a kindred spirit. She lingered at the counter for a moment, looking around the cafe like she was seeing it for the first time. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "there's something special about this place. It's like, I don't know, it has a soul. Not many places feel like that anymore." Her words struck a chord in me. She was right. This cafe did have a soul, because I had poured mine into it. Every table, every cup of coffee, every detail was a reflection of the journey I had been on, the path I had walked to rebuild my life. And to hear someone else recognize that made all the hard work worth it. "I think that's the best compliment I've ever gotten," I said, genuinely touched. Jessica smiled again, and this time, it felt like the start of something. Maybe a new friendship, or maybe just a shared understanding. Either way, it felt good. As the day went on, I found myself thinking more and more about the conversation with Jessica. The cafe did have a soul, but it wasn't just the place itself. It was the people, the community that had grown around it. It was the life I had created after the storm of betrayal had torn through everything I knew. In a way, I had been rebuilding not just for myself, but for everyone who walked through those doors. Each person who found comfort here, each smile, each connection. They were all part of the healing process. And now, looking around at the bustling cafe, I realized I had done more than just survive. I had thrived. That evening, I sat at one of the tables after closing, looking out at the now empty cafe. The quiet felt peaceful, not lonely like it had before. I thought about how far I had come, from the moment I found out about my wife's affair to the moment I walked out on her, and now to this. My cafe, my life, my future. All mine. The pain of the past still lingered, but it no longer controlled me. It was part of my story, sure, but it wasn't the whole story. I had written new chapters, filled with growth, resilience, and hope. And as I sat there, sipping the last cup of coffee for the day, I realized that I was ready for whatever came next. The future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. The morning light filtered through the cafe windows, casting a warm glow across the tables as I opened for another day. The bell above the door jingled softly as the first customers of the day strolled in. I greeted them with a smile, feeling more at peace with every passing moment. Life had settled into a rhythm that felt comfortable, yet exciting. Every day brought new opportunities, new challenges, and new reasons to keep pushing forward. The cafe wasn't just a business anymore. It was a living, breathing extension of everything I had become. And the town? It had embraced me in ways I never expected. I had found not just a place to live, but a home. A few days after my conversation with Jessica, I noticed her becoming a regular fixture at the cafe. She'd come in, sit by the window, and work on her writing. Sometimes, we'd chat when things were slow, sharing stories and ideas. Her presence was a reminder of the new connections I was making, the new life I was creating. It was a fresh start, one I hadn't realized I needed until I found it. One afternoon, as I was wiping down the counter, she approached me with a nervous smile. "I've been thinking," she said, shifting from foot to foot. "I want to host a small reading night here, for local writers. I think it could be something special." Her idea caught me by surprise, but in the best way. I hadn't thought about hosting events like that, but the more I considered it, the more I realized how perfect it could be. The cafe had already become a gathering place for people in the community, and this felt like the natural next step. "I love it," I said, grinning. "Let's make it happen." A week later, the cafe was buzzing with excitement as we set up for the reading night. The turnout was better than I could have imagined. Writers from the town, and even a few from nearby, came to share their work. The space was filled with creativity, passion, and a sense of togetherness that made the room hum with energy. As the night went on, I found myself sitting back and just watching, taking it all in. The laughter, the applause, the conversations that followed every reading. It was everything I had hoped for when I first opened the cafe, and more. Jessica approached me during a break, her face glowing with excitement. "This is amazing," she said. "I think we've started something." I nodded, feeling the same energy she did. We had started something. Something real, something meaningful. And it wasn't just about the cafe anymore. It was about the life that was growing around it, the community that had formed. As the night drew to a close and the last of the guests left, I locked the door and stood in the middle of the now empty cafe. The chairs were still scattered, the remnants of a night well spent. I looked around at the space I had created, and for the first time, I felt truly at peace with where I was in life. The past was behind me. I had survived betrayal, heartbreak, and loss, but I had come out stronger. I had built a life that was mine, one that no one could take from me. And now, I had the future ahead of me, filled with endless possibilities. As I flipped off the lights and headed for the door, I paused for a moment, taking one last look around. This cafe, this town, this life, it was all mine. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, I knew that no matter what came next, I was ready. I had found my way forward, and this time, I wasn't looking back. Have you ever found yourself starting over in unexpected ways? Share your story below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more.